The great Göktürk Empire once ruled over the vast steppes of Eurasia. Stretching from Manchuria to Ukraine and from Siberia to Afghanistan, the Ashina dynasty had managed to unite all Turkic tribes and, against all odds, returned to power after 50 years of oppression by the Chinese. But with the fall of the Second Turkic Empire in 745 AD, the dream of uniting all Turks under one banner, with one Turk to rule them all, was shattered. As a result, Turkic tribes left Eastern Asia en masse. While some migrated into China, many fled to the west of the continent. A group that is very much distinct from the rest settled in the region of the Aral Sea in Central Asia. 24 Turkish families founded a new state which we call Oghuz Yabgu. Translated, this simply means society ruled by the king. Although never an empire, these semi-nomadic Turks formed the basis for the most important Turkish empires in history, like the Seljuk Empire and the Ottoman Empire. At the same time, the Oghuz Turks have been shoved aside for far too long in public media and even academia worldwide. It's time to change that. But before we start, don't forget to like this video, subscribe and click on the little notification bell so that you won't miss any updates. With that out of the way, let's talk about the legendary Oghuz Yabgu State, its structure and culture, religion and foreign policy, and most importantly about its lasting legacy on Turkish history.
They became Khazars, rulers.
Ohne sie findet man keine wahre Freiheit.
The Oghuz Turks are believed to have originated from the steppes of Central Asia, specifically around the Altai Mountains, Irtysh River, and Yenisei River. They were part of the larger Göktürk Khaganate, which existed from the 6th to the 8th century AD. The Oghuz Turks were initially a pastoral nomadic society, primarily herding sheep, goats, and horses. They lived in tribes and clans led by begs. This is the traditional Old Turkic version of a bey, a duke. The many begs were united by the Göktürks but retained their autonomy. Once the Second Göktürk Khaganate collapsed, the Oghuz became completely independent. However, the Göktürks had lost their empire to a coalition of Basmul and Uyghur Turks and Chinese. The Chinese of the Tang dynasty advanced far into Central Asia with the goal of annexing what was once within the realm of the legendary Han dynasty. Thus, the Oghuz Turks were on the run. 24 Oghuz Turkish families arrived at the Aral Sea in western Central Asia and established a new confederation that was centered around the Sirdarya River in present-day Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, and extended to parts of Turkmenistan and Afghanistan. The Oghuz Turks are said to have been nomadic peoples, but they were actually semi-nomadic. This means that the men and women of the 24 tribes had permanent residences, but tended to leave their home once a new season started. In the winter, they would leave for the warmer south, and in the summer, they would return to the cooler north. Thus, the Oghuz Turks all had at least two places of residency. In that regard, they were just like many of the other Turkic peoples of their era. That being said, at the beginning of the state at around 750 CE, the Oghuz used to dwell in yurts. But within time, they built houses and established actual cities, one of which was Yenikent, New City in Turkish, which became the capital of the state. Later, the settlement of Yand became the new capital. There are traces of both cities, as well as many others within Oghuz Turk territory, which prove that the 24 tribes did indeed become sedentary at some point. Still, given the difficult circumstances of the Eurasian steppe belt, they had to rely on animal husbandry, particularly cattle, sheep, and horses. The Oghuz Turks were known for their skilled horsemanship and archery, too. Now let's talk about the 24 tribes that we have mentioned a few times already. The state was made up of various tribes which were grouped into two wings: the Bozoks, gray arrows, and the Ujaks, 3 arrows. Some of the prominent Oghuz tribes included the Kayi, Bayat, Bayundur, Kinik, and Afshar. These tribes would later play significant roles in the formation of various Turkic states, such as the Seljuk Empire and the Ottoman Empire. One very important tribe was that of the Beyenek, who seemingly left the Federation in the 9th century and wandered further westwards. After their arrival on the European Black Sea shore, they came to be known as the Pechenegs, nomadic Turks on the lookout for a new home that regularly were at odds with the Byzantine Empire. One of the most important and useful sources about the Pechenegs was written by Anna Komnena, daughter of the great Alexios I, who in 1081 became emperor of the Byzantine Empire and restored parts of former Eastern Roman glory against the Seljuk Turks. Anna would regularly speak of the Scythians attacking from Ukraine and Moldavia, as this was a term in use since antiquity for every nomadic society that tried to invade Central and Southern Europe, with the exception of the Huns, the first Turkic people to attack the Romans. Funnily enough, Anna would correctly call the Seljuks Turks. Little did she know that both the Pechenegs and Seljuks came from the same place, spoke the same language, and had the same origins. In any case, parts of the Pechenegs stayed in Central Asia. Thus, we know of 24 Turkish tribes that resided near the Aral Sea. The reason why we call this state Oghuz Yabgu is because the tribes used to elect one person to hold the highest office of the state. Thus, he would become known as a Yabgu. This title is derived from the Ashina clan of the Göktürk Empire. Before founding the empire, the Ashina called their own tribal chiefs Yabgus, and later this became a title akin to viceroy. Now that these great empires were no more and no one had any legitimacy to rule over all of the Eurasian steppe belt again, the newly established states one by one started calling their leaders Khagan. Thus, we had the Uyghur Khaganate as well as the Karluk Khaganate, or the aforementioned Khazar Khaganate. Khagan meant as much as emperor, universal ruler of the nomadic peoples. But the Oghuz did not use this title for their chief. Out of respect for their Turkic kin? Nobody knows for sure. But what we can definitely record is the general structure of this state and the political situation. Each tribe or clan ruled over its own territory within the state borders. They were politically autonomous within the Yabgu state, meaning that all 24 tribes made their own policy without interference from the other members of the federation. Nonetheless, they pursued a common foreign policy. That is the reason why very rarely our sources about the Oghuz Turks would single out one or more tribes, simply because whenever they went to war, they'd always stick together, forming one large Turkic army, standing united against their enemies. And enemies the Oghuz Turks sure had. In order to understand what made the Oghuz Turks special, we need to analyze their foreign policy. As the Turkish families settled between Amudarya and Sirdarya in the 8th century, they were confronted by a number of rivaling states. Their neighborhood was quite volatile. In episode 2 of the Khan's podcast, we had mentioned that several Turkic states served as bulwarks against the advancing Islamic caliphate of the Arabs, including the Khazars, Tokhara Yabgus, and Turk Shahi. However, the Oghuz Turks were also involved in this conflict. The Oghuz also waged wars against their Turkic neighbors, the Khazars and Karakhanids. But first things first. The scholar Ibn al-Athir remarked in the early 13th century, when writing about the events of inner Islamic conflict, that the Oghuz were a tribe which migrated from the borderlands of the most distant part of the Turks to Transoxania in the days of al-Mahdi. This person, in turn, was the reigning caliph of the Abbasids from 775 to 785. Al-Athir also claims that al-Muqanna, the Zoroastrian leader of an anti-Islamic revolt in Khorasan, would have called the Tengrist Oghuz Turks for help. Peter B. Golden, an eminent authority on Turkic history, remarks that the Oghuz Turks would have been difficult neighbors, which makes sense if we further take into account how they were situated in Central Asia. Golden states that while they were under pressure from the Kipchak Union, they raided Volga Bulgarian and even Finnic lands, while also crossing into Khazar and Samanid territory in the west and east, respectively. A Byzantine scholar, Konstantinos Porphyrogenetos, reports in 950 that the Oghuz Turks used to be allies of the Pecheneg, who had left the Yabgu state, as we mentioned, against the Khazars, but that later they switched sides and came into conflict with the Khazars. According to Ibn Fadlan, from 920 to 930, the Oghuz were prisoners, held by the Khazar ruler, which points to a lesser position of the Oghuz within the Turkic world. But a decade later, the Oghuz would directly raid Khazar lands in the winter, advancing as far as to the Volga River. By that time, the Oghuz, Pecheneg, and a Turkic tribe called Oz had formed a coalition against the Khazars. The Khazar Cambridge document, however, reveals that later, the Oghuz Yabgu, described as the king of Turkey, would have helped out the Khazars to beat off a Byzantine-induced attack by the Alans. Thus, Golden classifies the Oghuz as an unstable element and notes that it is more likely that instead of acting in concert, certain groupings of the Oghuz would have taken part in individual military operations, thus pursing their own foreign policies. Furthermore, there is no evidence whatsoever for the Yabgu, who is supposed to be the king of the Oghuz Turks, acting as a spokesperson of the entire confederation at all. We know that he existed, as is remarked in all of the aforementioned sources, but it seems that the Turkish tribes did have lots of autonomy. Perhaps they used to be united in the beginning and slowly pursued their own goals as geopolitically the situation changed. Much has been said about ancient Turkic culture on this channel. We have dealt with the principles of Tengrism, the original religion of all Huns, Turks, and Mongols, as well as the Töre, the ancient law of the Turkic peoples in particular. By the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, the Turkic world gradually changed. You have seen the many Turkic empires of that time. The Khazars on the Caucasus, Volga, and Crimea, for example, became Christians and later converted to Judaism. The Karakhanids, on the other hand, were the first Turks to convert to Islam. The Uyghurs in the Far East had become Manichaeist, later Buddhist. And smaller Turkish states like those of the Türk Shahi adhered to a mix of local religions like Zoroastrianism with Buddhism and other religions. But the Oghuz? They stayed true to themselves and refused converting to any religion. This suited their semi-nomadic lifestyle too. Being on the open fields of Central Asia and with the need to rely on livestock farming instead of large plantations, the 24 tribes basically lived the lifestyle of their ancestors further east. This is what made them so different from most of the other Turkic peoples at that time, save for the Pechenegs, who also stayed Tengrist for the longest time. The religion of Tengrism is clear-cut, but not dogmatic in nature. In essence, Tengrism is a religion with shamanistic and animistic elements that originated in northern or northeast Asia and was practiced by various Turkic and Mongol peoples across all of Eurasia, from Manchuria to Ukraine. The religion is named after Tengri, the sky god that is considered the highest deity in the Tengrist pantheon. He is an omnipotent, supreme, benevolent, and all-encompassing deity, in fact, that watches over and guides all living beings and was called God of the Turks by several sources. When other Muslim travelers observed Oghuz Turk traditions, they pointed out that in ceremonies or when going to war, the Turks would point with their fingers to the sky and shout, "Bir Tengri." This means, literally translated, one God. The Oghuz Turks had likely started out as polytheistic Tengrists, but like the Göktürks had adopted a monotheistic view. It was the Oghuz Turks who had become the most confident in believing in one God. Other specifics of the Oghuz Turkic lifestyle do of course include the role of women within the family and society as a whole. Ibn Fadlan traveled through the Oghuz Il, the Oghuz country, and was in shock as to why and how the Turkish women were treated somewhat different than what he himself was accustomed to in Islamic lands. He spoke of pollution and filthiness among the Oghuz Turks, but what he was really referring to was the fact that the Turkish women did not cover their entire body. They were not veiled at all and free to roam outside as they saw fit. For Ibn Fadlan, indeed a shocking thought. The Oghuz Turks, nevertheless, were not isolated from the rest of civilization. They used to trade with the merchants of foreign lands and were in the vicinity of important Silk Road hubs, including the cities of Bukhara, Samarkand, and Otrar. Over time, they did integrate aspects of other cultures, like the use of loanwords from Persian. And Islam did also spread among the Oghuz Turks, but at first only affected a few tribes. One of them was the Kinnic tribe, led by Duduk, a commander for the Khazars. As the Khazar Khaganate was destroyed by a coalition of Rus and Oghuz armies, we can assume that this was the reason for the fallout between Duduk and the reigning Yabgu at the time, whose name is unknown. As Golden suggested, by the late 10th century at least, the tribes of the Oghuz country pursued their own foreign policies. After Duduk's death, his son Seljuk took power. He also clashed with the Yabgu, but this time separated his tribe from the rest. The Kinnik settled west of the Aral Sea and then, on the lookout for new pasture for their livestock, left the area altogether and wandered to the south into Iran. Seljuk and his son Tuğrul defeated the Turkish Ghaznavids in a series of battles and established the Seljuk Empire. Thus, the Kinnik became completely politically independent. The Ghaznavids had been Muslim, and Seljuk himself had also converted in the year 985 after the fall of the Khazars. As the Seljuk Empire expanded into the Levant and even Anatolia, the other Oghuz tribes followed suit. As a result, Turkish tribes like the Bayat, Bayundur, Aymur, Afshar, Salur, and Sepni settled in the area between Azerbaijan, northern Iraq, northern Syria, and Anatolia. The Seljuk Empire soon disintegrated, and the Turkish Oghuz tribes used this as an opportunity to create their own independent states. By 1300, there were dozens of so-called Beylik states ruled by the Bey, the modern Turkish form of Beg. One of these Beyliks was founded by the Kai tribe in Bithynia, the ancestors of the Ottomans. The Salurs founded the Karamanid Beylik, and the Bayundur the Akkoyunlu, which would later become the only Turkish state left in the fight against Ottoman expansion. But more about that in another video. In conclusion, the Oghuz Yabgu State played a crucial role in the history of the Turkic peoples and the wider Central Asian and Middle Eastern regions. Its emergence, culture, and foreign policy laid the groundwork for the rise of the powerful Turkish empires, which would shape the course of history in the region for centuries to come. There are even more states and empires established by Oghuz Turks, not only in Anatolia. Thus, the Oghuz Yabgu State might be considered the most important of all Turkic states, because modern Turkish history had such an impact on world history that it deserves its own video series. The Oghuz Yabgu were the bridge between the Göktürk era and the era of Turkish domination in the west of Asia. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a like. If not, tell us in the comments section as to why and what we could do better. See you next time.